And we're live. Welcome to Music Matters with Jason Tramm, and thank you so much for being a part of our musical culture community. Here on this podcast, we interview distinguished artists in the who've done great work and who are doing interesting projects. And here we talk about the current events and what's going on in the arts today. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for helping our community grow. We just had 2,068 subscribers, and we grow every day thanks to people like you who like our videos and subscribe to the channel. So please, it means the world to us. Subscribe and get involved. Feel free to text us in the chat if you have any questions of the artist. We love when you join in the conversation. We have a really fascinating guest today. We have Chris Becker, a noted composer, also a writer as well. And I got to work with him on a ballet last summer, and it was fantastic and a really original idea and some great music. So welcome, Chris Becker.
Thank you, Jason. It's an honor to be here.
Now you're based in Houston. How are things in Houston these days?
Houston is, yeah, it's very lively with the new year. You know, the new year has come, and now all these great concerts are happening. You have the symphony, the opera, but also all these independent organizations, smaller ensembles. They're all getting out there and getting their seasons rolling. So there's so much to go and see and hear every week. In the visual arts community, same thing. Things are just, it's almost like spring is here, but spring is not here yet, technically.
So you've worked a lot with the visual community. I'm really fascinated by those collaborations. So as a composer, it must be really interesting to bring new works to light around new works being created for the visual medium.
Mhm. I When I got to Houston and began writing, my main focus I thought would be music, and I started meeting visual artists and kind of became my friends. You know, in New York, I think my tightest friends were in the music and dance community. For whatever reason, in Houston, the visual arts community, those were the people I connected with, and they enjoyed hearing about music. Like they liked the fact that if I went in to interview them, I don't have an art history degree. I don't have the pretensions of I write for art form or what have you. To put it simply, I'm approaching it like I'm a creative person too, but I do music. A lot of artists play music too. You know, many artists will like pull out their guitar in an interview, be like, "I play too," and so we we
Absolutely.
we vibe in that way too.
And we've always inspired each other. Look at the French Impressionists and Debussy and all the great painters and Manet and Monet. And I just love that
Absolutely,
kind of cross pollination of great artistic merit.
absolutely, absolutely.
So did you always know that you wanted to be an artist?
I knew you were going to ask me that, and I was thinking hard about that, going back to like when I was 8, 9 years old. Um, I do know the creative arts were a lifeline for me as a young person. So that would be anything from music coming out of the stereo to comedy to television to drawing, all of that stuff. And I explored the visual arts in junior high school and even on into high school. But I got into music relatively late, around the age of 16, and started taking piano lessons with the intention of learning how to write music. I was more interested That was what I was interested in. I didn't really care if I could become this may sound very strange. I didn't really care if I could become a good pianist. To me, I was like, well, the piano is kind of like the typewriter for the composer, right?
It's the medium. That's interesting. Okay.
Right, right. Now, if you're a really good pianist, it becomes a computer, you know. For me, it became something else because I'm not a great pianist, but that was my avenue in to looking at scores, listening to music, and being able to see what you had to do on a page to get sounds. Um, so did I always want to? I don't know. It was always a lifeline, and I don't remember entertaining wanting to be anything else other than maybe a car racer,
Ooh.
which who knows why, but I just found that exciting,
I
but that
just
didn't
had
last.
a colleague, a baritone, an opera singer, who who's a black belt in Taekwondo and loved that, and then he had an injury, then he had to stop that, so then singing kind of just fell into his lap. I just love how
Oh,
I love the artist's journey. I'm just fascinated by that. Every time I have these type of conversations, I'm always interested in how people's paths are unique and different. Did you come from a musical family?
no, not at all. I remember my mother's mother, my grandmother, singing, not professionally, but I remember nearly falling asleep in the back of a car after she had picked me up from a piano lesson, if I'm remembering correctly. So I must have been a teenager, must have been relatively young, and hearing a voice and thinking it was the radio, and then coming out of my sleep and realizing it was my grandmother who was singing. Um, And interestingly, she was always very supportive of me if I had her sit next to me and I sat at the piano and said, "I wrote this," and played something that lasted 30 seconds and maybe wasn't all that good, but she always said, "That's beautiful." And sometimes that's all you need, you know? Is
Need
so
those listeners, right? That's what we do. We leave the
yeah,
listen and react.
a little positive reinforcement goes a long way if you have already the stubbornness and drive to create, because everybody else is gonna tell you, you're not very good, or you suck, or that other, but that one person, and especially if it's a family member, but it could be a close friend, I think that's really important,
When
but
did you
no,
write
not
your
a
first
musical family.
composition?
Let me see. Well, we have I started writing stuff that I wouldn't call compositions when I was a teenager. And the reason why I said wouldn't call them compositions is that I was learning how to do it. I had stuff on the page. A lot of the times I would mix it up with spoken words because I didn't sing. So I would write the words on top of over the music. It was really when I got to college, in he says, looking at his notes, in 1987, when I got into a composition program at Capital University, the Conservatory of Music in Columbus, Ohio, that I began composing, I learned how to notate. And that's where I first really met musicians and heard them playing what I was doing. Now, college was really where that began, I guess.
Yeah, to me, those first sketches are so important, though, just to get your feet wet and to get, start documenting sound, and must be really exciting to get to school and then to hear people actually who have the capability to really bring it to life.
It's overwhelming. Well, for me, it was overwhelming because it was such a new experience. It occurs to me too, when I was a teenager, one of my favorite toys was a tape recorder. And as you know, I'm also very interested in the recording studio and creating music that, for lack of a better word, you might call contemporary music concrete or electronic music. A lot of music I've done for dance has been in the studio with musicians coming in, recording their parts, and creating pieces out of those performances. I think that goes back to the tape recorder, which you could argue is a musical instrument. And as a kid, I certainly was using it as one. I just didn't know I was. To me, it was just something I did, right?
We've the
So I think my
technology. I grew up with a tape recorder, hearing my voice,
right.
and that was always a part of my training as a singer, was listening to, like, as the vowels and all the stuff, and it's yeah, it becomes an instrument, right? It's something we've grown up with, something we've been kind of always had with us.
Mhm. How did you feel when you heard your voice?
Oh,
Did you
I still hate it.
is see, we all have that. Yeah, yeah.
My son's a videographer, and he videotapes my conducting performances, and I'm always like, ugh.
Well, that's normal. That means you're an artist.
Yeah, because I always hear everything. I hear every, like, tiniest fraction of missed entrance, or I remember that a string player missed was not together with the section. I remember that stuff. We never forget that.
I remember, I'm probably not going to quote him correctly, but the great guitarist Mick Goodrick said something to the effect of that, when you discover your voice, you may not like it, but it is your voice. I was like, okay.
Pretty fascinating. Pretty fascinating. Yeah, I think it's an important part of becoming an artist, is being self-critical, and but of course we can go too far with that. You have to, but it always reminds me of what kind of habits I have, and breaking out of habits. I also, teaching is really important for that, because whenever I get in front of my undergraduates and I teach conducting, I always have to kind of re-examine my technique and say, how do I show a good fermata, and how do I? And it constantly reminds me of technique, and to keep my technical parameters in line.
Right, because your students are going to ask those questions. They're not going to let you slide, right? They're
And they
going to
can
say,
go on my
"What did
YouTube
you
channel
learn?"
and sit there and watch my Beethoven 5, and how did I do the fermatas, and how did I do the fermatas on this and that, and often I
Wow.
get asked.
I think, and you mentioned being critical too, and I think that's really essential. And a lot of artists get stuck with that, where all they do is critique themselves, and then they don't. For composers, they don't finish a piece, or they say, "Well, it'll never be," or they don't. They do things that the end result is they're not creating. And there is a balance there where you are able to look at stuff and say, you know what, that could have been better. That I want to fix. We were talking about the Lost Princess of Oz, and I'm going back, not necessarily critiquing the music, but I know that, for instance, if I if I take like the bass line down an octave in an instrument, that's going to open up the sound even more. That wasn't there in the performance, but I have some objective distance from it now. So I'm critiquing the music, but I guess in a healthy way, you know.
Yeah, there's always the editing and revising process. You look at
Yeah, I
composers
guess that's what. Yeah.
like Beethoven, who was constantly changing even his most early works. He would kind of they were never finished, quote unquote, until
Well, yeah, yeah. Stravinsky did the same. We just heard the Rite of Spring, this incredible performance, and God knows, what version that was. I mean, I can't imagine what the original sounded like in 1919 or whatever it was, but he definitely worked at that and revised it too quite a
it's one
bit.
of my favorite stories. Actually, caused a riot in his performance, the first
Yeah,
performance, and people
yeah,
don't realize that the riot was partially because of the music, but it was also because of the choreography being so bizarre.
absolutely,
They were
absolutely.
forming these ugly angles, and people were expecting beautiful lines for traditional French ballet, and
Well,
they were giving them this neo-primitivist, you know, incredible staging that people just went bonkers.
the Russians were the exotic people at that time in Paris. Like you went to see the Russian ballet to see something that was going to be different then, I think, but I guess, what Nijinsky did that time was really different. And
I
that,
read this incredible report of that the Parisian society thought the Russians were kind of primitive, and that's how they were selling tickets because like they were like, yeah, this will be different, and kind of like they expected this kind of because of course ballet in Paris is like you know,
Mhm,
is like
right.
religion, right? It's always since the court of Louis XIV, right, and before. So they brought these, this production played on those kind of prejudices, and they went over the top with the kind of Stone Age choreography and sacrificing the virgins, and
Hmm.
what a great story. They talk about Sasson being there and like horrified because he was one of the old guard, and Gounod was there, and they're like just horrified by what they were
But Debussy loved it, right? And he's,
loved it.
I mean, he
The
wasn't the old
Enfant
guard.
Terrible Debussy loved it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a beautiful piece of music. It's a wonderful.
It's fascinating how music can capture a moment in time as society was heading towards the catastrophic effects of World War I, eventually World War II. You hear the oral kind of change in society. I'm just fascinated by that.
Mhm. And it's in retrospect too. At the time, I'm not. It's not like, well, this is. It becomes evident over time. It occurs to me too when you asked about, when did you write your first composition? I think the first time too, I began collaborating with dancers was very important as well, um, because that opened up my music in a. It made I started making music in an even different way, and I wasn't just hearing a performance; I was seeing it.
That's
Um,
so interesting because we come from different disciplines. Me being a conductor and a music director, and you being a composer, and I just love working with composers too. And I love premiering pieces and working on things I've never been done before. That is one of my favorite things to do as an artist, because I don't have 100 years of performance practice to measure up to and to have to go through all my parameters. You get to be part of something brand new and creative, and it's just so interesting to everyone's individual input from the composer, then asking the composer, what exactly do you mean? Because I need an Ouija board to do that with Beethoven, kind of thing.
Well, we need you. There's certainly plenty of composers who conduct their own works, and I don't have that skill set yet, believe it or not, and it's something I'd love to learn how to do. But it's nice to get those parts prepared and then hand it over to you, and then be able to like listen to it and have you kind of like corral. I mean, you bring just watching you conduct and prepare those musicians. The first two sessions before rehearsals was just so. Well, it's encouraging, but it was also so helpful for me too.
Well, it's such a process, and I'm always it's always interesting to me to see, from conception to execution, to watch it come together is kind of like an alchemy, right? To watch it, from the nascent stage. And I know, like on that composition, I know it was a quick turnaround, and you were like the ink was barely dry off the page, and you were zipping it across the country, and then we were getting it, and then sending it to the players, and then I love that process.
That was the most music I'd ever written in a relatively short amount of time. I did begin as soon as Gabriel talked about the project. I knew from experience that working with dancers that we would get rolling at the ninth hour, like
And
at
we're
the
talking
last
about
minute.
Gabriel
Yeah,
Chajnik, and
yeah.
we premiered this ballet last summer. This is The Lost Princess of Oz, And Gabriel has been on Music Matters. Gabriel Chajanik, who's a brilliant choreographer and a wonderful musical thinker in mind. Like I know he's a dancer primarily and had a great career as a dancer, but a choreographer. But he's got a really good sense of music and musicians. It's something very important to him. He loves working with live
Hmm.
musicians. So we've done
Yeah.
several projects over the years, including a few premieres, and they're always fascinating.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And
And
this
I
one
mean,
was definitely no exception because he always calls me on the phone at some off hour. Like he's like, okay, I see tabla drums and a string quartet, and or I see this mixture of bluegrass mixed with ballet, mixed with classical, mixed with country. Like what?
absolutely. Well, the first thing he mentioned to me was the banjo. The rest of the instrumentation, he was up to me. And what was amazing, I think, for me as a composer, is that he came through with a lot of instruments. I mean, we had vibes, we had marimba, we had bass drum, we had,
Lots of color.
I mean, there was a lot of color there, and he gave it to me. But I wanted to go back and say, because I think this is helpful for maybe composers and dancers. Again, in collaboration, is understanding that a lot of times you may be asked to do a lot of stuff at the last minute very quickly, which is why I started doing stuff before we even had a contract before, because I knew that was going to happen. I knew the deal would get done. For me, I wanted to start exploring a banjo. For me, I wanted to start listening to repertoire that I thought would inspire me and start sending him sketches even early, even months before we got to you and got in that room with the musicians. So, sitting around pouting and waiting for direction is not really what I'm about. Like, all you got to do is say, "Hey, Chris, can we do some with, I don't know, harmonica?" Okay, and I'm going to start
Practical
my
range of the harmonica.
it's
Dig it in.
that speaking for myself, that's all I need, especially if there's movement involved too. And that's the other thing. Since I knew there was going to be movement, dancing, and I knew that the audience would be relatively young. I mean, there were parents there, but there were children there too. That was inspiring too. But I wanted to get the ball rolling, as it were, and that's typically what I do. I don't really wait for everything to be finalized. It's like I start work, and if it doesn't come through, then I've got some music that I could use for something else.
Now, I always find ballet composition. I guess this is the same for any staged work, but ballet in particular. I look at Tchaikovsky working with the different companies he worked with, and he called like writing a ballet making sausages because the choreographer gives you the exact how long it's going to be. He's like, and he was given the key it had to be, and how long it had to be, and the meter it should be, and like I mean, it was given parameters like strict parameters, and you kind of write within those parameters. How are you able to be creative within the parameters and limitations that are given to you through because it's a dramatic medium?
Oh, well, I mean, if I don't get those parameters, then I set them myself, because you need to get something done, right? And with a ballet with 2 acts of music too, it was
That was a long
important that
composition. Good
there's a
point.
lot of music, and
Yeah.
I had to make sure that every piece didn't sound the same, but they also had threads connecting them too. So, not to sound pretentious, but that's part of it as well. And you start noticing what you're doing, what maybe intervallically, like what you're exploring. Maybe there's certain chord resolutions that you're leaning towards, and they can recur in other, and all of that. But Gabriel more or less I'd be like, well, how long does this need? 2 minutes. I mean, okay, like that would sometimes the directions were much more specific, where I'd need 30 seconds of this feeling, then 10 seconds of that. He spoke more in terms of feeling. I didn't get
Hmm.
keys or um, anything much more specific than that. But then again, maybe we had a rapport going, especially since once we really got into this and I was writing like every day, where there's I don't know, it's like a psychic kind of thing. I mean, you with a good collaborator, you just kind of like have this intuition, and you do something, and they're like, that's it exactly, and you don't even have to have them give you too much direction.
I
So
love that.
yeah.
And watching it come together was really, really a pleasure. Getting the music and to go through it and kind of mapping it out for myself and then bringing the players in and then watching it hit the stage. It's amazing how hard it is to do any of these projects but in the end, I'm like, well, there's nothing more exciting than bringing a piece of creative art to life.
And if you have, well, it's on me to make sure those parts are great, that score is clear. And I referred to a good friend of mine named Tom Myron. who's a fantastic composer based in Massachusetts, and my former teacher and mentor and still very good friend, Dr. Rocky Reuter, who you met, I know,
What
at
a
when
what
you
a
came up.
wonderful guy. I had a
He's
long
he's
conversation with him watching
he's
them come together.
incredible. Those 2 guys really helped me prepare that score because of again, because of time. I'm like, you can't I wanted to make sure I'd, like, at the very least, like, given everybody a part where they weren't gonna ask a whole lot of questions like, "Hey, there's a measure missing here," or, "What do you want there?" I mean, a little bit of that is gonna happen, but I tried to, like, make sure that when you had a blueprint or a map, that was very clear, and then we could get to work, and you brought in such great musicians
Oh boy,
too. You really did. Yeah.
it's the yeah, like Gabriel and I work together, the musicians have to be high caliber because we have very little rehearsal time.
Right.
That's the case with any professional organization. Limited rehearsal time, a lot of music,
Mhm.
but I find that and like when I come in prepared, the musicians are good, and the composer has got a clear idea. Things come together pretty quickly.
Your violinist gave me a really high compliment, the violinist. She said, "We've worked with other composers on new pieces who don't know what they want. You know what you want." And I really, I mean, that was
That was a
just
Brooklyn based, and Brooklyn's got a very hot new music scene, so she plays a lot of new music, I'm sure. And I've worked with several, and it's like, okay, we need I need guidance on the page, and but I love the process of like we would talk about it, and then some things would change. You'd change articulations, or I would change the way I approached it. You know, it's it's always interesting because people don't realize if you're not a professional musician that the musical language is it's not like concrete. It's like there's so much give
right.
and take within it.
Right, right. Absolutely, absolutely. And as a especially when you're working with dancers, I think composers, maybe I'm speaking only for myself, but I think generally composers need to let it go a bit and not say, absolutely, the tempo has to be this, or it needs to be this long, or no, you can't cut that section because you're in the process of a collaboration and things have to happen quickly. But also, what you're describing, if you're premiering, I don't know, a new piece by John Zorn, for instance, that's different than what we're talking about in that you might have time in a scenario in a relationship to really like unpack a score that looks very is very complex and maybe needs some revision, maybe needs a lot more. Whereas with a project like The Last Princess of Oz, I feel like my job is to like make sure like I said before, make sure everything is ready to go. And then we have time to make changes. Then we have time to talk a little more creatively because we're not worried about what did you want here or did you the cello can't do that, etc. I hope that makes sense.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, that was a revelation for me, I guess. That's that was
Who are some of your inspirations when you were in your studies?
I wanna think carefully about that. I know when I first met Rocky, and actually, I was talking about this with my wife last night because we saw, Werther, right?
Oh, I
Massenet's
heard that's a
Werther.
wonderful. I have friends who were in that production.
No kidding.
It got some great reviews. Yeah,
It was incredible. Okay.
I love that opera.
Now, Massenet is not, I wouldn't say is an influence, but he is name checked by a woman named Laurie Anderson, who is, I guess you would call a performance artist, multimedia artist, somebody who works with music, but also works with visuals, also works with acting, video, sculpture, and all these things. She
Mm.
was a big inspiration to me as a high school person. And I guess because the music was incredibly cool, but there was also all this other stuff happening too. It was an amalgamation of all the arts. When I first met Rocky, when I first entered his office as a young student, he asked me the same question. He said, "Well, who do you listen to? What are you listening to now?" And I said, "Well, I'm a big fan of Laurie Anderson." And he said, "Oh, I think 'Oh Superman' is one of the great art songs of the 20th century."
Hmm.
She dedicates that song to Massenet because a couple lines from a Massenet, I don't know, choral piece or song is incorporated into the lyric. But anyway, when Rocky said that, it was like, oh, like the angels land there, because no one had ever said that to me before. So definitely Laurie Anderson was key to kind of all this thing we were talking about, working not just with musicians but working with dancers, working with visual artists, working outside of your medium, looking at music and saying, well, this doesn't have to be done this way. We might be able to create a different sort of environment to present these sounds. So I think she's primo. She's somebody who was a huge influence on me. And this may sound funny too, but David Bowie,
Ah,
again, really for the same reasons. And this is a guy who comes from, his pianist Mike Garson called him the Miles Davis of rock and roll.
wow.
And the reason he says that is because of his collaborative genius, that he knew how to work with pick and choose. And we were talking earlier off camera about how important it is to find a musician and have this relationship and be able to bring them the part and have them like dig into it and say, hey, this sounds great. This you might want to change, man. And that for me is like quintessential Bowie, album to album to album. I also did an
Ziggy
arrangement.
Stardust. Yeah, he's
Yeah,
wonderful. I love, all the way to the very end, his Black Star album.
Black
Man,
Star's
that
amazing.
Blake breaks my heart that he was dying when he was writing it, and just incredible music there.
And there's a whole new set of collaborators, all these incredible, quote
Jazz
unquote jazz
artists, yeah.
players from in there, but they're jazz that's very 21st century jazz. I One of the first collaboration with Axelrod I did was an arrangement of Bowie's Heroes for a string quartet. And we worked with a great choreographer named Blakely White McGuire. And she's the one who heard a MIDI version of my string quartet, loved it, and said, hey, I'm going to be doing some choreography for Axelrod. Can we do this? Maybe we can get a string quartet to play it, which I was like, fantastic, let's do it. And that began my relationship with Axelrod. And it
Well,
was very important. It was a wonderful, wonderful performance.
well, fantastic, and a tribute to David Bowie. I think that's really neat. And well, I wish I could speak to him because I have a lot of questions. A real brilliant man.
Indeed, indeed.
I love the way that that you are able to blend like how does like popular musical styles, how does that filter into your like more classical type compositions?
I'm getting my, it's funny. I've been di- actually, let me go at this a different way. When I'm tasked to do a composition, either there's a commission or I just want to do a project, and I'm going to instigate it myself. One of the things I noticed that I do is I put a stack of CDs on my desk, and it's music that somehow I feel is going to relate to what I'm going to ultimately produce. So I looked to, for The Lost Princess of Oz, I had Tom Waits because I loved his junkyard orchestra sound. I
Hmm.
loved how he used percussion in a very humorous, very aggressive way. Um, I had Tchaikovsky. I had, of course, like Swan Lake. I had the Nutcracker Suite. I had things like that. I think I had Carl Stalling, the great composer of Bugs Bunny cartoons and things like that. And I don't think my music approaches the complexity of Carl Stallings, but that sort of approach to matching music and making music is funny. That was I understood I wanted to make music. If I started laughing when I was listening back to something, I was like, hopefully will translate. I think, so everything goes into the pot. It might be pop music, it might be Tchaikovsky, and hope I feel like there's so much I haven't listened to. It's so funny. I don't know if you feel this way. I'd be interested to hear you speak to this, but I feel like God, there's so much to listen to, and all of that is going to go into your bag of tricks as a composer.
Honestly, I do more and more pops music these days, and I just
Mhm.
absolutely really enjoy the genre. And I think that even in quote unquote classical music, Western classical of the 20th century, 21st century, we're seeing lots of cross pollination. We're seeing that we're seeing music from other cultures. We're seeing music of popular music filtering in. I think that's an interesting and yeah, I think it's pivotal to bringing new audiences to the art form too.
Mhm. And the musicians have the facility to play those different styles that you mentioned, and I think, for instance, the percussionists you have are that were in the Lost Princess of Oz were guys that were very comfortable playing maybe Broadway music, then playing classical, and then playing in a rock band or something like that. And for me as a composer, that's great because when we're talking about my music, if I mention, say, Duke Ellington in a particular track, they're not going to be like, "Well, who's Duke Ellington?" or whatever. It's we have that language there, but they also have the skill set, to do
I
to do
think that
so.
in today's economy, you have to be good at a lot of things. If you're a
Yeah.
percussionist and
Okay.
you want to work, I think you have to be like that was an interesting case because you needed good, really good reading. Like you had to be very good pitched percussion.
Hmm.
which is a
Right.
subset of players, and I had to find people who were good pitch percussion, but could also play anything else and had a sense of styles.
Yeah, and what we're forgetting here, not talking about, is a lot of people in the field of pop music, they do not read music. Now, some of them do, but a lot of them don't. And I imagine, have you found yourself? Tom Myron speaks about this, where you have a guest artist in front of an orchestra who all have notation in front of them. The person singing, they don't read scores. That, so you have to kind of bring them together. Is that something you experience yourself, or have experienced?
On pop jobs, certainly.
Yeah, okay,
Even
okay.
yeah, it's interesting. Like when I work in opera, not so much because that's here's the score. It's a
Sure, right.
different medium. But when you
Yeah,
start getting more modern, absolutely, because there's an
mhm,
improvisatory nature to some of that composition. You have to kind of that's built in, right? When you're doing jazz arrangements,
mhm,
you just have to how many repeats are you going to do? There's the more modern you get, the more that becomes part of the music.
mhm, yeah.
So, and it's I enjoy that process because it's fun to work with artists from different genres. I think it really fires people up, and
Oh, yeah.
I'm always impressed by how my quote unquote classical colleagues can really cross over. I've got my concert master who I work with a lot. She's great at bluegrass. I have another one who does great at Irish fiddling. You just never know. People are really. I think people are have diverse skill sets these days,
Mhm.
more
That's
than we
that's
needed in the past.
yeah, yeah, 100%. I agree with that. And when I moved I lived in New York before coming to Houston, Texas, and the musicians who initially became my network of players that I would invite over to record and create scores for dance. Mainly, that's what I did in New York, was music for dance. We're from the rock world. Initially, I reached out to people who were, I would say, classical or even jazz musicians, but I found my music opened up in very exciting ways when I was working with people who were rock players, and these guys and gals didn't read music, which was just fine, because what I wanted, you can't notate anyway. It was just not, that was not, and that's the sound I wanted and I wanted to capture too. But there's a whole art to that as well. I don't think in hierarchical terms either,
I
as like
just did a
pop. Yeah,
really interesting recording project with a friend of mine. I just did it was record. It was a compositions for string orchestra, and we had
yeah.
about 15 string players in the room, and it was he had his classical quote unquote classical pieces. He had two kind of fugues that were mapped out, and then we did what he was like. He was a bass player who played with the members of Billy Haley's Comets. He toured with them for years and years and years, and a lot.
Wow.
I don't think those
Wow.
guys read at all, but he
Yeah.
he did read, and he also played like rockabilly bass or whatever it was. And we did a piece called Bernard Edwards Jam. It took that famous Bernard Edwards bass line, and
Yeah,
he
I know it.
wrote this scripted funk piece, and it was supposed to feel like it was improv, but it was for strings, so it had to be written down carefully. But like
Mhm.
the rehearsal process took a long time to get the classical players to feel as if it was improv with a conductor.
That's
That
interesting.
was my
That's
challenge.
interesting. Yeah, yeah. And was there a how about when we talk in terms of feel? Does that have to do with where they come in on the beat, where
Yeah,
they?
everything from where
Yeah,
they come in
yeah,
on the beat to how they play a grace
yeah,
note to how
yeah. Okay.
the balance of the players, and do you play heavy, do you play light? And I mean, it took a while. We did a lot of takes of it to get it right. It was a shorter piece, but it was a lot of fun. Shout out to Alex Craven, who writes really interesting. He did an arrangement of Rock Around the Clock, which it was hard as can be. I mean,
I
man,
want to hear this. I want to hear these.
I'll
This
send him.
sounds very. Please,
It
please
was a
do.
lot of fun. I mean, and in the end, it was like a lot of fun to kind of dig in. And we had to think about it because I had really good players in front of me who worked very hard. But my son's a he's a jazz fusion drummer,
Mhm.
and watching him with the groups, they don't read this with a conductor in front of them. They just kind of feel it in the moment. They improvise over it, so it's very different to get that feel with players.
Mhm. I mean, sometimes the difference in feel can become a part of the music as well. Maybe you don't want the strings to be playing like the jazz players, for instance. But I mean, that's the spectrum we get to play with, and it depends on the music, and it depends on the vision of what you're trying to present, of course.
So what type of projects are you working on now? So what are the how does it work with a visual artist when you're working on like composing a piece for an installation, or do you see their sketches in advance, or how does that process work?
Oh, that's I mentioned. Okay, we were off camera. We were talking about this. The thing I'm obsessed with now is a piece for unaccompanied cello that's going to be premiered here in Houston. Well, here in Texas, in April of 2023, as part of a large group outdoor installation at a place called Splendora Gardens, which,
Hmm.
if you could imagine, is basically a big forest, that a big piece of property that's owned by the great sculptor James Searles and his wife, who's also a master sculptor, Charmaine Locke.
Hmm.
He invited a group of artists to come in and create installations in what you call a bower, sort of like a cleared area of the land with trees hanging over it, bugs crawling around, feral hogs visit the places at night. I mean, it's the jungle, you know. Um,
Wow.
we're going to be premiering music and there's going to be sculptures in all these bowers in April. And what I came up with, one of the sculptor I'm working with, her name is Rachel Gardner, and she had this vision and has constructed a giant chair, um, a chair that several people could sit on. It's a big giant um, this chair that's going to be in this bower. The cellist I'm working with, Patrick Moore, who's an amazing musician here in Houston, he's going to premiere the piece sitting on this chair, and there is room for him to sit on the chair. He doesn't sit in the chair; he sits on the chair because it's that big, right?
Wow.
Um, so the vision there is yeah, I know Searles's work. I know Rachel's work very well, and I love her sculptures. I love her. Rachel Gardner is her name, and I definitely check out her stuff. Um, but also the outdoors is inspiring me too. You know, I'm like, this is going to be played
I love this kind of
outdoors,
music for its location built, and
right?
music and art built for its location.
You got
How
to
does the
think about
audience? How does the can the audience just come freely? They have to buy tickets. How do they get? How can they go see this
it's going
installation?
to be on April 23rd in the from 4 to 7. It's going to be a free public event. We don't have a program order yet. So I know I want this played twice. And I think that night we're going to just kind of have to hang loose. It'll kind of be like Woodstock, I imagine. Like this band will go
Um,
on and this band is like whatever, maybe. I'm not quite sure, but it's as a composer, I have to, and Patrick and I have to kind of like just sort of feel it out. I can imagine him beginning to play this and then people kind of hearing the cello and then making their way through the woods to discover this guy on a giant chair playing a cello, which again influences the composition. You know, the nature of that vision and discovery is something I'm thinking of. You know, this is not going to be a quiet piece. Yeah,
how
I mean,
long?
like,
How long? How long are you writing? What's the time? Are you thinking like half an hour or 10 minutes or?
oh no, yeah, it's going to be like a 6 or 7 minute piece at the most. Yeah,
Okay.
that's going to be it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's because sometimes I've seen there was a concert in New York City. It was with the music of John Taverner. It was like 23 hours long.
Sure. Well, the whole concert. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, like a festival of stuff. Yeah, yeah. What's the different, well, you have Morton Feldman who, of course, composed string quartets that lasted hours, and I've experienced a few of his performances. Well, Werther is like 3 hours. My God, well, that's a lot of music.
I saw it with Jonas Kaufman at the Met, and yeah, it's a long show until he and they've had all sorts of wild videography in that production at the Met, and he, when he shot himself at the end, the blood splatters across the screen. It was very striking visually.
Wow, wow. Well, it's funny the amount of time too. I want to make sure my cellist has time to prepare the piece. So if I gave him 30 minutes of music, which there's no way in hell I could do that right now.
That's a
But
lot of cello music. Yeah,
well,
30.
yeah, it's not in my or maybe a three movement work, for instance. Like
Mm.
I'm now, in the midst of what I think might be one of three movements, but I'm not going to do two other movements. But again, these practical considerations, like I said, this is not going to be a quiet piece. What I mean is that something very delicate and minutia is not really going to translate in the great outdoors. People are not necessarily going to hear that. It also, how does this piece begin? Well, I want it to call out to people. I want it to say, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. And people go, what is that? And they come to it.
Wow. It's a cool. It's a these installations sounds like a fascinating process.
But James Searles is amazing. He's an amazing artist. Yeah.
And I love sculpture, and I think sound and sculpture certainly have a lot to share with each other.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
How do you find collaborative partners?
in let me think about that too, because I just the people that I collaborate with, I've collaborated with for such a long time. There's a video artist, performance artist, visual artist named Jill Guyon, Jilguyon, who I met through a friend who she had asked to create some music for a video, and he couldn't do it. But he knew my music and said, "Hey, I want to introduce you to my friend Jill. She needs some music. Are you interested in?" And we just hit it off. I didn't go looking for her. She didn't find, it just was one of those weird. And I've lost track of how many collaborations we've done and how long we've known each other. And it's been a very successful, creative relationship. Rachel Cohen, choreographer in New York, sort of the same thing. I remember meeting the person who was in charge of the costumes on her project. And she said, you might want to meet. I told her I was interested in working with dancers. She said, "Oh, you might want to meet." And we met, did one piece, and then did another, and then we became good friends, and we did several pieces. So it's funny. You want to put yourself out there. I think you want to have your music available. You want to have like a Bandcamp page. You want to, you know, release some music. You want to get out there in the community too, and go hear concerts and go support your peers. Go and listen to other composers and all of that, and let people know I'm open, I'm interested. But how we meet our collaborators, it's a very weird, mysterious thing, because these opportunities just kind of seem to happen, and you're like, well, I don't know how it happened. They just called me up.
Well, it's exciting that you've collaborated with so many interesting people and across different genre boundaries. I think that's fantastic, and I wish you, as these continue to happen, some more exciting and amazing collaborations. You also do a lot of writing. Tell us about the writing part of your career.
Um, when I got to Houston, well, I had been interviewing my friends in New York for a blog. I was at a time where everybody seemed to have a blog. We moved here in Houston in 2010. So previous to that, musicians especially were encouraged to get on places like what was the pre MySpace, things like that, and also blog like crazy and get into arguments and all this kind of, just have a presence on the web. I started interviewing musicians and artists that I felt weren't getting the kind of coverage that they deserved. I thought these were friends of mine, or at least people whose work I admired. I carried that into Houston, but then it became a job, something that I could get paid for. And so right now I write for a magazine called Houston City Book, where I mainly just cover the arts and the broader sense of the word. It's music, a lot of visual art, some dance and theater. Um, I also took it upon myself to write this, and I think I'm going to hold it up, and the title will be backwards. But let me see here. Anyway, but
Freedom of expression, beautiful.
this is a collection of interviews with women jazz artists. There's 37 interviews in here with
Wow.
musicians, everybody from like people you might know, like Diane Shure, Terry Lynn Carrington is in here, Eliane Elias, but also Anat Cohen, the great woodwinds musician, and also some people here in Houston and other avant-garde musicians that people may not be as familiar with. This came out of my work as a journalist and as a writer. I was encountering at the time women in jazz, for lack of a better word, and this was pre-Me Too movement, right? And I thought, well, is there a good book, a collection of interviews of jazz musicians, but it's just women, where we look at the history of jazz and we put it through that filter and say, well, what are the contributions of outside of the dudes we know about? There really isn't any. And, I did the book as a labor of love. And what's wonderful is it's available on Amazon, folks. It's continues to
Check it
sell,
out.
a few copies every month, and hopefully is read by young musicians, not just young women, but musicians who just are curious about what it's going to take to realize your full potential as a creative artist, because that's what the book became about. It's not so much about gender discrimination and things like that, although that is addressed in a couple of the interviews, at least two of the interviews. But it's mainly about what does it take to be a musician? What kind of sacrifices are you going to make? What's enjoyable and what's challenging about that whole process too. Um, So your show, really resonates with me. Music Matters, it does. Yeah.
Certainly, yeah,
Yeah.
I like to explore some of the challenges we all face, and I don't think there's ever an easy period for artists and musicians. I mean, it just
No.
whether it's tight budgets or whether it's just opportunities because of budget constraints and less performances are happening. But creative people make things happen. I'm always amazed by the creative spirit that allows that to be, even during challenging times.
And there's so many yes to all of that. It's not going to change. It's not going to get easier. I don't. I think even the composers we know, who we say, wow, they're doing really well, like Philip Glass, John Zorn, Nico Moli. They all face continued challenges. They do this because they love it. It's a vocation, and you make sacrifices to do it. And you make sacrifices to do anything, to raise a kid, to open your own business, to whatever you do in the arts. But composition is it's the one profession where you could be working really hard for a long period of time, and man, nobody cares. It's
Ask
like,
Charles
yeah,
Ives. Yeah.
well, and you got to do it. You got to, like, you kind of have to hold yourself accountable and say, well, I don't have a pending performance. The musicians I know are all on vacation, and I don't really know much about this particular instrument, but you show up at the desk and you do it. There's it sounds depressing, but it can be a very invigorating thing as well. I think, at least for me, speaking for myself, it's a lifeline.
What about writing? How does that cross pollinate your musicianship and your artistry?
Right, I get to ask questions. Well, if I'm interviewing a musician, I get to ask them questions about music that I just want to know more. With the Rite of Spring, I interviewed that was performed here in Houston recently. I'm sorry, the Houston Symphony recently performed the Rite of Spring, and I thought, let's talk to the bassoonist. I want to
Mm,
talk to somebody about that
that
opening
opening
solo,
line, yeah, there's nothing
and
like it.
and I there was stuff I didn't know bassoonists. I'm sorry, this is naive. I didn't know they made their own reeds, for instance. Like, that's what
That's
she does.
half their life.
It is. That's what
And
I learned
when
from
they're not making them, they're complaining about the ones they've made.
she was, the bassoonist I interviewed, she was working on a special reed for that opening solo, which
Oh,
was even more complicated than I never listened to that solo and thought, boy, that must be really hard to play. Well, guess what? That's a really hard thing to play on the bassoon. So that's one. So that there's some, like, knowledge you get to take
did you
into.
put the quote from Sasson there? If that's a bassoon, I'm a buffoon.
Nope, nope, nope. I didn't
I'm
know.
a
Wasn't aware of
baboon. Excuse me.
that. I'm a baboon, huh? Um, but also giving back to the community too, I think, is important to flip this around too. It's I get something from it. Creatively. Education. It's an education for me. I get paid to do it. But this is also a way for me to reach out and give something back to something I feel is important. I feel like, I love interviewing a visual artist, for instance, who's never been interviewed before. And that's, they're like, how did you find me? And I'm like, well, I saw your work over here and it just looks really great, and your story, and that's just delightful. Um, I guess I guess that answers your question.
Absolutely.
Not, if not.
I think it's fantastic. Personally, I've done almost 300 of these interviews on Music Matters. Every
Wow.
one of them, I wound up learning something. I find something really interesting, an approach, kind of a thought process, and I'm so curious about the musical mind and the artistic mind and how people. A couple of them were stand-up comedians. I'm just fascinated by their process too because I don't know that
Yeah.
much about it, and I'm just like, and I watch a lot of them, but I'm not in that field. I just find it's just fascinating to kind of absorb and see how different artists construct and how they create.
Me too. Me too. And I think artists across disciplines should be talking to each other, too. And because the way a dancer, for instance, hears music is very different from the way I hear music, and I probably hear music very differently that you, Jason Tramm, maestro conductor, hears music too. That might be an oversimplification, but there's things you can discover and find commonalities and say, oh, that's how you do that, or that's why we're having trouble here, is because you guys feel the beat this way and I feel it this way, for instance. Yeah,
Fascinating.
yeah.
So, what do you have coming up next? What's next on the docket? You've got the concert, you've got the art installation. Anything else? Any other concepts brewing?
I am working. I'm revisiting the music to The Lost Princess of Oz and doing some revisions to the music. introducing more of the banjo into and creating a suite of music um, that I would love to, when it's done, publish and make available to ensembles in high schools or college level to say, oh, this is unusual: percussion, cello, violin, piano, and banjo. But can
Where
we
can
do?
people go and hear that? Where can they go hear your music?
Yes, I have a Bandcamp page, and it is what is my address? It's Beckeresque, Beckeresque.bandcamp.com. That's a good site to get an idea of what I do, because it's a combination of mastered tracks of music, complete pieces. There are also sketches up there, just things that I do in my studio. A lot of it's very therapeutic, and just kind of like, let me just put it out there, just the way an artist does a sketch. There are musical sketches on there as well. So there's a pretty wide range of music available up there for dance, video, and chamber music, and stuff like The Lost Princess of Oz is up there in its MIDI form
Hmm.
as well. So.
And to find out more about this wonderful and interesting composer and writer, you can go on his website, which is linked in the description of this video. Make sure you check it out. He's doing some beautiful work and a real kind of I think some exciting music and some exciting projects. And if you're in Houston, check out the premiere of the new cello work.
Indeed.
What's the name?
A Gift from the Bower, which is the name of the overall installation. But I'm like, that's the perfect name for a cello solo. So,
Something about music being made come alive and art in outdoor space. That's really special.
Well, that word gift, I think, is really important to me too. There's a gift that we receive when we're working with other musicians, when I'm working with you, when I'm working with a visual artist, and I'm giving something back too. It's like I create this piece and like, okay, this is my gift back to you, James Searles, and Rachel, who created this incredible chair, and Patrick, who's willing to sit there and dig into my voicings and chords and tell me what's working and what isn't. So.
Well, keep sharing your gifts, and I hope we get to collaborate again sometime. And
Man, me too.
next time you're in the north, I'd love to come out there and sometime to Texas. And my daughter actually lives in Pearland.
Okay.
She's going to college in where's she going to college in up in the north? Where's that, Quentin? Oh, Trinity University up in San Antonio.
Is she studying music or
no? She's studying, I think, sociology at the moment.
sociology?
I've got of my four kids. My youngest is 18. I've got television production, nursing, sociology, and the youngest one is going to be jazz and fusion drums. So it's a wide range.
Okay, one day I want to interview you, and we're going to talk about how one raises four children while doing all these incredible things that you do.
Now they mostly work for me. They all work for me when they're around. But they certainly grew up, and there's been opera singers around the house, and they're used to, like, Uncle so and so is an opera singer singing at the Met, and this one is a violinist, and this one is a choreographer, and it's like they just like, oh, they're just these crazy people running around their lives. But I'd love to talk about that. It's a lot of fun. It's been balance, and I'm still trying to figure out how balance works, but we certainly do our best to kind of having a family and being a conductor has been. I'm a single dad who raised four kids. It was a crazy journey, but I'd love to talk about that.
Indeed, a friend of mine calls it we're the tightrope walkers union. So and we all walk that tightrope. Whether in different depending, no matter who we are, right? So.
These lives everyone's life is so fantastic and crazy, and that's what makes it interesting. Between the gigs and all the concerts and rehearsals, and I have to pencil in when I'm like going to my son or taking him to a college audition, and then working it out. Well, we figure it out.
That's awesome. Congratulations.
Well, my friend, continued success, and I can't wait to hear what the next chapter holds for you.
Thank you. I'll share the cello piece with you when that's done, and I'll keep you in the loop with the Lost Princess suite.
And put me in touch with some really interesting visual artists. I'd love to get them on the show. It'd be really cool.
Oh yeah, that would be if you're open to interviewing some visual artists. I know plenty of them in this town, and I think they'd love to talk to you.
Especially the ones who really have that love of music and kind of, because I'd love the perspective from an arts person. That'd be really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. I will. I'll be in touch, man.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Continued success. Thank you
Thank
for
you,
joining
Jason.
us on Music Matters with Jason Tramm, and please remember to subscribe and smash that bell icon for the most up-to-date information on our upcoming guests and topics. Thank you so much for joining us, and remember, keep music alive.
Amen.